The Cold War, a defining period of the 20th century, was more than just a geopolitical standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a battle of ideologies that transcended borders and permeated every facet of global interaction. On one hand, there was American capitalism, promoting democratic governance, individual freedoms, and a market-based economy. Opposing it was Soviet communism, advocating for a state-controlled economy, a one-party system, and collective ownership. These two conflicting ideologies were at the heart of the Cold War, leading to a complex global struggle that unfolded on numerous fronts. Propaganda became a critical tool, with both blocs attempting to spread their ideologies worldwide, infiltrating education, media, and cultural institutions. Countries around the globe became battlegrounds of influence. As the superpowers sought to align others with their respective visions, espionage played a significant role, as each side sought to gather intelligence and undermine the other's strategies. Spy networks spanned continents, with covert operations seeking to gather political, military, and technological secrets. The Cold War also witnessed cultural exchanges that were often tinged with ideological undertones, as each side attempted to showcase the superiority of its way of life through art, sports, and science. This ideological confrontation shaped not only the politics of the era, but also left a lasting impact on global relations, culture, and society, echoing into the present day. The Cold War era was marked by an unprecedented arms race, with the United States and the Soviet Union amassing large arsenals of nuclear weapons. This perilous competition reflected the depth of mistrust and the severity of the ideological divide between the capitalist West and the communist East. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, became the grim cornerstone of Cold War deterrence. Based on the premise that any nuclear attack by one superpower would result in an immediate and devastating response, ensuring the total annihilation of both the attacker and the defender. Under MAD, both superpowers developed extensive and sophisticated delivery systems for their nuclear stockpiles, including intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs), submarine-launched ballistic missiles (SLBMs), and long-range bombers. This deadly accumulation ensured that, despite the constant tension and occasional confrontations, neither side would initiate a nuclear conflict for fear of its own destruction. The nuclear arms race also led to several close calls, with the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 being the most notorious example, where the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. The lasting legacy of the arms race is a world that continues to live with the complex challenges of nuclear proliferation and the daunting task of ensuring global security without resorting to the specter of total warfare. The space race, a salient chapter of the Cold War, was ignited by the Soviet Union's surprise launch of Sputnik in 1957. This milestone marked humanity's first artificial satellite to orbit Earth, symbolizing a formidable display of Soviet prowess. The United States, spurred by the perceived threat to its technological dominance and national security, responded by galvanizing its resources to compete in this new frontier. This cosmic competition saw a series of dramatic achievements and was punctuated by significant events, most notably the American Apollo moon landings. When NASA's Apollo 11 mission touched down on the lunar surface in 1969, it signified a monumental victory for the United States. The iconic phrase, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," declared by astronaut Neil Armstrong, reverberated as not just a triumph in space exploration, but as a strategic conquest in the Cold War narrative. The space race transcended mere competition. It catalyzed technological advancements, united nations behind grand visions, and expanded humanity's horizons beyond our terrestrial confines. Though rooted in rivalry, the quest for the stars ultimately underscored a universal truth: our shared potential for greatness when challenged to reach beyond the known limits. Throughout the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a global chess match, advancing their ideologies through proxy wars rather than direct military confrontation. In Korea, the conflict crystallized into a brutal war dividing the peninsula along ideological lines, a division that persists today. Vietnam became another battleground, where the horrors of war were broadcast worldwide, igniting international and domestic protests. Especially in the US. In Afghanistan, the Soviets faced their own quagmire. Their invasion triggered a fierce resistance, bolstered by US support, contributing to the eventual unraveling of the Soviet Union. Latin America and Africa also became theaters for Cold War skirmishes, as both superpowers vied for influence. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Angling Civil War, these interventions often left long-lasting impacts on the local populace and regional politics. This pattern of indirect conflict allowed the US and the Soviet Union to avoid a catastrophic world war, but at the cost of local stability and millions of lives. These wars by proxy fueled global instability, setting the stage for some of the present-day conflicts and shaping the geopolitical landscape of the post-Cold War era. The formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) in 1949 marked a significant moment in the Cold War era, created as a collective defense alliance. It brought together the United States and Western European nations in a mutual pledge to defend one another in the event of an external attack, primarily anticipating Soviet aggression. This alliance was a direct response to the growing Soviet influence in Eastern Europe and served as a clear demarcation of the divided allegiances within the continent. In 1955, the geopolitical landscape was further polarized when the Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe formed the Warsaw Pact. This was a collective defense treaty that stood as the Eastern Bloc's countermeasure to NATO. The establishment of the Warsaw Pact solidified the division of Europe into antagonistic camps, symbolizing the ideological divide between capitalism and communism that defined the Cold War. These military alliances epitomized the intense rivalry of the period. They reflected a world divided by the Iron Curtain, where two superpowers and their respective allies stood in a state of heightened readiness for the entirety of the Cold War. The enduring legacy of NATO and the historical significance of the defunct Warsaw Pact remain key chapters in understanding the Cold War's strategic and military history. The term Iron Curtain was famously coined by Winston Churchill in 1946 to describe the metaphorical division between the Soviet-dominated East and the democratic West, signaling the stark divide of Europe post-World War II. The ideological and physical barriers between the two blocs became ominously concrete with the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Erected overnight, the Berlin Wall turned into the most prominent symbol of the Cold War's division. It stood not only as a barrier to prevent East Germans from fleeing to the West, but also as a poignant reminder of the political and social divide that ran through the heart of Europe. Families were torn apart, and the city of Berlin, once vibrant and whole, became the front line of a tense geopolitical standoff. The wall was fortified over the years, embodying the suppressive nature of the Eastern Bloc's governance and the lengths to which they would go to maintain control. Yet, it also became a canvas for protest and artistic expression, capturing the human yearning for freedom and unity. Its fall in 1989 was as sudden as its rise, and became a potent symbol of the end of Cold War tensions. The demolition of the Berlin Wall resonated around the world as an iconic moment of victory for liberal democracy and a pivotal step towards German reunification, marking the beginning of the end for the Soviet hold over Eastern Europe. In 1962, the fragile peace of a world divided by the Cold War nearly shattered during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Following the unsuccessful US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Fidel Castro's Cuba drew closer to the Soviet Union, leading to the secretive installation of Soviet nuclear missiles on the island, merely 90 miles from the US coast. The discovery of these missile installations via U-2 spy plane photographic evidence plunged the whirled into a state of panic. For 13 tense days in October, the Kennedy administration deliberated on a response, while Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev stood firm on the deployment, arguing it was a means to protect Cuba from further aggression. This nerve-wracking standoff prompted an unprecedented diplomatic and military mobilization. The US imposed a naval blockade around Cuba, demanding the removal of the missiles and the cessation of their construction. The world watched, holding its breath, as two nuclear-armed superpowers teetered on the brink of war. Eventually, a secret agreement was reached. The US pledged not to invade Cuba, and quietly agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey, while the Soviets agreed to dismantle the Cuban missile bases. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis brought a sigh of relief across the globe and led to the establishment of a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, the so-called Red Phone, reducing the risk of future misunderstandings escalating into conflict. The 1970s marked a significant shift in the Cold War dynamic, a period known as détente, characterized by a thawing of the icy relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. This era of reduced hostility was not merely a passive phenomenon, but an active pursuit of strategic arms control, epitomized by the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks SALT. SALT I 1972 and SALT II 1979 were two rounds of negotiations that resulted in agreements to limit the growth of the two superpowers' nuclear capabilities. The talks were an acknowledgement of the danger that the nuclear arms race posed to the world and a recognition that mutual cooperation was essential for global security. During this period, the superpowers also signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile ABM Treaty, limiting the deployment of missile defense systems. This treaty was significant, as it acknowledged that defenses against nuclear weapons would only spur further offensive capabilities, thus exacerbating the arms race. These agreements were substantial not only for their content, but also for fostering a dialogue between two ideologically opposed nations. Although détente cooled some aspects of the Cold War, it did not end the competition for global influence, and confrontations continued in the Third World. Nevertheless, détente showed that through dialogue and negotiations, even the most hardened of enemies could find common ground for the sake of global peace. The 1980s heralded a significant pivot in the Cold War's trajectory. Under the aegis of US President Ronald Reagan, Reagan's approach was a pronounced departure from détente, characterized by a robust reinforcement of military might and an assertive rhetorical stance against the Soviet Union, which he famously branded as the evil empire. President Reagan catalyzed a substantial increase in US defense spending, aiming to pressure the Soviet economy and challenge its technological advancements. This included the development of new weapon systems and the modernization of existing arsenals, reinvigorating the arms race between the two superpowers. A pivotal element of Reagan's strategy was the Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI). Announced in 1983, SDI was an ambitious plan to create a missile defense system that would protect the United States from nuclear attacks by intercepting incoming ballistic missiles. The program, though technically challenging and controversial, projected a future where nuclear attacks could be nullified, thus undermining the principle of mutually assured destruction that had deterred nuclear conflict. SDI was both a strategic maneuver and a psychological gambit, serving to unsettle the Soviet Union's confidence in their nuclear second strike capability. Although the feasibility of SDI was debated, it exerted pressure on the Soviet Union to engage in new arms control negotiations, ultimately contributing to the endgame of the Cold War. Reagan's defense policies not only reasserted American resolve, but also underscored the role of technological innovation as an instrument of geopolitical power. The denouement of the Cold War, a profound geopolitical shift, arrived with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, an event that symbolized the ebbing of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. This monumental occasion presaged the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. marking an end to the decades-long ideological contest that had dominated the global stage. The legacy of the Cold War is indelible, resonating through various facets of international affairs. Its conclusion reshaped the architecture of global politics, leading to a unipolar world dominated by the United States. It engendered a new era of diplomacy and international relations, where former Soviet states sought integration with Western institutions like NATO and the European Union, profoundly affecting the geopolitical landscape. Technological innovations spurred by the Cold War arms race and space competition have permeated civilian life, giving rise to advancements in telecommunications, computing, and material science. Military strategy and doctrine were forever altered as nations recognized the devastating potential of nuclear warfare and the importance of international arms control agreements. Culturally, the Cold War influenced literature, film, and art, reflecting the anxieties and hopes of the era. Its end brought about a reassessment of national identities and ideological beliefs, shaping the contemporary worldview and continuing to inform the discourse on security, governance, and the global order. The period's lessons remain a touchstone for current and future generations navigating the complexities of international diplomacy and conflict.